All right, welcome back, everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about the thought of the Russian political philosopher Alexander Dugin. It seems like a timely video to make because Dugin is a name that's in the news a lot lately. Um, a lot of people would say that some of the events we're seeing right now are either directly inspired by Dugin, or if not directly inspired, that his thought represents one of the worldviews on display quite well. There's been all sorts of allegations and theories that Dugin is highly influential on Vladimir Putin. He's been called Putin's Rasputin. Um, he's considered and called a fascist by some on the left. Some on the right see him as a malevolent figure that is a kind of communist that wants to restore the Soviet Union. So there's a lot of competing narratives about Dugin, about what he's about, what he believes. So I think it would be good to do a general overview of his thought. Now, the man himself first came to prominence as an anti-communist dissident in the 1980s and began to travel Russia doing lectures on Eurasianism and to offer a critique of the Soviet Union from the right. He was also involved in a political organization. He founded the Eurasia Party and the National Bolshevik Party with Edward Limonov. But primarily, he is a philosopher, and he's written more than 30 books, including 4 books on Martin Heidegger. Dugin considers himself a Heideggerian. He sees Heidegger as hugely important for Russian philosophy. He sees him as kind of the basis for his idea of a fourth political theory and a break with Western liberalism. And of these 30 books, one of the most influential would be The Foundation of Geopolitics, which was published in 1997, which outlined his vision of a geopolitical strategy for Russia after the Soviet Union. And it's been noted that that's been used as a textbook in the Academy of the General Staff of the Russian military. So that is something that's used to suggest that Dugin has quite a large influence on the thinking of Russian elites and how they view the world. Although I would say I think a lot of that gets very overstated, especially his influence on Putin. From what I know, if he ever had one, it's definitely waned. It doesn't really exist now. I believe he was fired from his teaching post in Moscow a few years ago over comments about the Ukraine. So he's not quite as influential figure as some would portray him, but certainly in terms of this idea of Eurasianism, in terms of putting forward Russian philosophy, he is, probably the most influential Russian philosopher, at least in terms of his reach in the West. His magnum opus is the Fourth Political Theory, which is published in 2009. And the stuff I'll be covering in this will be taken from that, but primarily I'll be drawn from a book called Eurasian Mission, published by Arctos, which outlines his thought in a series of essays and lectures, and is probably more directly political than Fourth Political Theory, ironically. There's some more kind of esoteric philosophy in Fourth Political Theory. Eurasian Mission is more focused on real-world politics and his geopolitical vision. So to get started, I think a good place to start is with Dugin's idea of the West. Now, you see this in Russian thought. When Russians and Eurasianist thinkers talk about the West, they're not really talking about the people in the West. They're not really talking about Western civilization as we might consider it. But they're talking about essentially Atlanticism and the sort of international order since the mid-20th century. Dugin considers what Western civilization is now. He calls it Roman-German civilization, but it has become this totalizing version of secularized Christianity with values like individualism, egoism, competition, technical progress, consumption, and economic exploitation. Dugin is certainly not an anti-Christian thinker. He is himself an Orthodox Christian, and his thinking is actually, to understand it, you have to kind of understand how much he's coming from an Orthodox perspective. He is a traditionalist. His Christianity is central to his worldview. And it's central to his critique of the West. He believes that the West dominates the world not because of superior values, but because of technical progress. Other civilizations are judged only in terms of rationalism and their own technical progress. So the West, as a civilization, has become this monstrosity that has universalized itself. Its values have morphed into this atheistic, liberal, all-consuming worldview, and now it is a threat to the entire world because it seeks to export that by force. And this is where you get the idea of unipolarity. Unipolarity simply is the idea that there is, since the fall of the Soviet Union, there is one geopolitical pole, that is the United States, that is dominant of the entire globe geopolitically. The current world order is unipolar, and the global West is at its center, and the United States is its core. The United States is the core, the European Union is kind of the periphery, but still an expression of American power, but American power is projected internationally. Geopolitically, dominance of the world by the US in its imperial interest, this is what essentially unipolar world order is. It denies national self-determination, and ideologically, it's based on modern and postmodern values that are openly anti-traditional in nature. So the unipolar global order is constantly undermining and aggressing towards traditional societies that oppose the human rights doctrine, oppose the universalization of liberal values, the imposition of American economic imperialism. And so this is the ultimate threat that Dugin is responding to in his thought. He draws, of course, on Eurasianism, and he is probably the most famous Eurasianist thinker. Eurasianism is quite a complex ideology. It views Russia as neither European or Asian, but that it follows a unique, it forms a unique civilizational geographical entity. It started with the Russian emigre community, some of whom had fled the Bolsheviks in the 1920s. Probably the most prominent one was the Orthodox theologian George Florovsky. He's one of the most influential Orthodox theologians of the 20th century. But there's various kinds of intellectuals who are involved in this movement. Orthodoxy was often common to them. And they believe that Russia or Eurasia's geography creates a unique ethno-cultural identity with a singular destiny to emancipate humanity from the hegemony of Western civilization. So central to Eurasianism, the idea that Russia is a unique civilizational entity, that it has a unique ethno-cultural identity. Some of the theorists of Eurasianism talked about the unique kind of ethnogenesis that happened between Central Asians and Russians, and also the unique kind of geographical destiny being situated as it is within and between Europe and Asia. And this is a map that someone has created, which is kind of how Eurasianists see the world, this Eurasianist perspective, where, as you can see, there's this great Eurasianist civilizational state that really includes the territories of the former Soviet Union, and with some Eurasianist thinkers, stretches as far as Iran, as far as the Balkans, and they view the world in terms of these kinds of civilizational states, the Chinese world, South Asia, the Arab world, and the West. And so they believe that Eurasia has a unique destiny in that. Now, as I say, it was formulated in the 1920s, but it really came to prominence again at the fall of the Soviet Union. This was a time when communism was collapsing, and there was something of an identity crisis for the Soviet Union, for Russians. There were people that wanted to move in the direction of liberal reform that ultimately won out. There were people that wanted to reform the Soviet Union along nationalist and statist lines, which is ultimately actually the direction that the Communist Party itself went in. And Neo-Eurasianism gained a following in the years leading up to the fall of the Soviet Union. Now, this second iteration of Eurasianism, the Neo-Eurasianism, was inspired primarily by the work of the ethnologist Lev Gumilev, who regarded Eurasians as what he called a super-ethnos, superior in spirit to their Western counterparts. So Lev Gumilev had kind of a unique theory of ethnogenesis and ethnos, and he wrote about the interactions between Mongols and Russians and other Central Asian groups, and he believed that this had created a unique kind of ethnogenesis of this Eurasian people, and that there was a spiritual component to the Eurasian people that gave them a certain superiority to the West, even though the West was clearly superior in material terms. So in the late 80s, as the Soviet Union was collapsing, there was a convergence between Soviet conservatives that were people embedded in the Communist Party that saw the direction things were going in and wanted to maintain the patriotism of the Soviet Union, to embrace social conservatism, sort of national Bolshevist view of things, and various other patriotic movements, Russian nationalist movements. And it was in this time that Dugin emerged to offer criticism of the Soviet system for, as he saw it, lacking spiritual and national qualitative elements. So this is really Dugin's unique contribution, is the introduction of these ideas based around traditionalism, people like Genon and Evola, and also the kind of national element. So the elements of Eurasianist ideology, these are the elements that Dugin lays out in Eurasian Mission as kind of the key tenets of Eurasianism. There's the idea of the demotia, which he contrasts with the liberal idea of democracy based around parliamentary democracy and the liberal notion of rights. Against that, Dugin believes in an organic democracy, and he takes inspiration from people like Rousseau, the idea of the general will, Schmitt, and de Benoit. He says the Eurasianist concept of democracy, demotia, is defined as the participation of the people in its own destiny. It's developed on the basis of social self-government and the peasant world. So it's this ideal of local governance, a democratic will being expressed, not in terms of just numerical kind of democracy or parliamentary system or rights-based democracy, but this more qualitative, kind of harder to define idea of a democratic will of the people on a very local level. Next, there is traditionalism, which, as mentioned, is Dugin's kind of unique contribution to Eurasianism. He was heavily inspired by the works of René Guénon, Julius Evola, and other people in the traditional school. And what they offer for Eurasianism is this idea of a critique of the modern world along spiritual, metaphysical lines. Traditionalists believe that we are in the Kali Yuga, which is a term borrowed from Hinduism, who believed that there was this cyclical view of time, and that currently we're in the Dark Age. And that leads to the kind of spiritual decay, quantitative view of the world that we see dominant everywhere. Also from the traditionalists, he gets this sharp division between the traditional and the modern world, and those two radically opposed way of viewing things. But ultimately, the key thing that Dugin takes from the traditionalists is this critique of the West and the modern world along metaphysical lines, rather than just this kind of economic or social critique. There's also a reassessment of geopolitics that is central to this, which obviously locates Eurasia as the key opposition pole to Atlanticism. And Dugin believes that Eurasianism can be the basis for a lot of unique insights and theory on geopolitics from a Eurasianist perspective. He looks back to earlier Eurasianist thinkers like Jean Thiriart, the Belgian thinker after the Second World War, who was the first person to present this idea of a great sort of Eurasianist zone. The term he used was from Dublin to Vladivostok. Dugin was inspired by that because he used that kind of map of things as the cover for his foundation of geopolitics. Also, Dugin makes use of Carl Schmitt's idea of a dichotomy between land and sea. this is something Dugin often talks about in his essays, what he calls the tellurocracy versus the thalassocracy. Thalassocracy is basically a seafaring nation, a seafaring empire. And Dugin believes that there's always this contrast between sea powers and land powers. He takes this idea from Carl Schmitt, but he elaborates on it, and Dugin coins the term tellurocracy to define a land power. And basically the idea is that with land powers, you get a core ethnic group that branches out, and there tends to be a more maintenance of tradition, more of a warrior society, conservatism, permanence of legal norms, a powerful bureaucratic apparatus, and centralized authority, a more sort of absolutist view of things. With the seafaring powers, it lends itself to liberalism. Seafaring powers, of course, they rely on international trade, interconnectedness, openness, liberalism, mercantilism. You know, many of the values we would associate with the British Empire that then came to be associated with the United States and the American Empire, which, you know, as we say, has now been made into the global values. So Dugin often uses this as a means of analysis. For example, he analyzed the last US election on this basis, that there is two Americas. There is the, you know, seafaring power version of America, which is the people on the coast, the people in the cities, who vote Democrat generally. But then there's this sort of land power version of the US. You know, this idea, people often make jokes about it, you know, the Democrats are people that have been to the beach, like, because you have the, you know, within America, the states that aren't on the coast, they're generally red. So Dugin thinks that you have this division even in the United States. You have kind of a land power that's more traditional, more conservative, more skeptical of liberal values, and then of course on the coasts you get the seafaring empire with seafaring values. The search for an alternative to globalism. Dugin wants Eurasianism to be a platform for all manner of anti-globalist, anti-liberal ideas. He says Eurasianism, in its wider meaning, thus becomes the conceptual platform of anti-globalism, or of an alternative globalism. Eurasianism unites in itself all contemporary trends that deny globalism any objective, let alone positive, content. It offers the anti-globalist intuition a new character of doctrinal understanding. Next, there's the assimilation of the social criticism of the new left into a new conservative or right-wing direction. It assimilates leftist critiques of the bourgeois Western system. Specifically, Dugin names thinkers like Michel Foucault, Guy Debord, and Gilles Deleuze. And he thinks that a lot of the 20th century work of the new left, sort of neo-Marxists, he thinks there was a lot of actually useful stuff in that they were critiquing liberalism, which Dugin sees as the prime enemy. They're critiquing liberalism, capitalism, economism. And so he wants to borrow this and sort of put a conservative spin on it. This is the same line of thinking you see in the French New Right. They embrace many of the Marxist critiques of capitalism while rejecting the left's kind of social doctrine. Dugin also hopes that there can be some kind of understanding with left-wing anti-globalism. He doesn't want to alienate the right or the left. He says that anyone that's an anti-globalist, any forces that are anti-globalist are potential allies, and there should be discourse with them. He also says that a key part of Eurasianism is third-way economics. He wants to look at the application of heterodox economic thinkers like Schumpeter and the nationalist Friedrich List, he named specifically, who had this idea of the customs union, of trade barriers and tariffs in order to industrialize a nation, or in this case a region. He calls for a new Eurasianist interpretation of John Maynard Keynes. And he wants to produce an economic model for the autarky of great spaces. So obviously, central to Eurasianism is this idea that the future of the globe is going to be these great regional spaces like Eurasia, like Europe, like North America. And so Dugin wants an economic model that is focused on modeling success for that. Investigation into the origins of sacredness. Dugin wants an interpretation of contents of rational culture through the lens of ancient pre-rational beliefs. Dugin is obviously very skeptical of modernism, of faith and reason that characterizes modernity. And he wants a new look, a new interpretation, new appreciation of our more ancient pre-rational beliefs. The tracing of human culture into ancient psychic layers and archetypes, and in this regard, someone like Carl Jung is an inspiration. And this ultimately is for the attempt to rebuild an original map of what he calls the sacred concept of the world, common to all ancient Eurasian peoples. So this is central to the idea of rejecting modernity, is the kind of re-sacralization of the world, the return of the sacred. That, you know, people like sociologists like Max Weber would say that this is inherent to modernity, is desacralizing nature, desacralizing the world. Things that used to be put down to magic or God or animism become rationalized, desacralized. Dugin wants to find a solution to this in a reinvestigation of these primordial archetypal ancient beliefs. So those are the key tenets of Eurasianism. And of course, it's in opposition to the globalist view. So what is globalism, according to Dugin? Well, we're witnessing the nation-state model being transformed into a global state. This is the idea of New World Order. He often uses that term kind of interchangeably. And there's pessimism within Dugin's thought about the possibility of global cooperation through globalism. Globalism presents itself as this cooperative mutualist enterprise, but again, from Dugin's perspective, it's really the imposition of one ideology as universal, true force. And globalism is the attempt to universalize the Western, and more specifically, the kind of Anglo-American worldview. So globalism is just the imposition of Atlanticism, though proponents, of course, have to deny this. In order for globalism, liberalism to be legitimate, there has to be the idea that countries are agreeing to this, that this is all an expression of the democratic will, and it has to mask the imperial aspect of it. So against unipolarity, the Eurasian idea suggests that the planet is actually consisting of a constellation of autonomous living spaces that are partially open to each other. Regions aren't nation states, but they're a coalition of states organized into continental federations with a large degree of self-government. So this is an idea that's popular in the New Right, especially the kind of French New Right that Dugin is partly inspired by, that, to quote the Benoit, that nations are too big for small problems, but too small for big problems. But they still want to maintain autonomy, religious, ethnic, or otherwise. And so the solution as they see it is this kind of regionalism, where you have this huge regional state that encompasses many different smaller nations, ethnic groups, religions. And you need this big regional entity to handle things like security, to be a proper opponent of globalism, of Atlanticism, to allow autonomy on the smaller level. And then you have maximum autonomy within that for the groups within it. It doesn't seek, though, to impose any universal value system. So this is also key to Dugin's idea, is that you have these huge regions that are necessary for security, that are necessary for a functional world order that can allow a variety of worldviews and proper diversity. But there's no universal value system, and there's maximal autonomy of values, of worldviews, of groups within that. Dugin also calls for a new platform for cooperation between all opponents of globalism. Something I kind of mentioned earlier, but he doesn't see the dichotomy anymore as left versus right. He sees that the second position, as he calls it, communism, attacked liberalism from the left. The third position, fascism, basically attacked liberalism from the right. With the fourth political theory, he doesn't see it as a left or right attack on globalism, liberalism. What he sees now is that there's a dominant center, and there's a periphery of all sorts of dispossessed groups that have some gripe with liberalism, with globalism, and he wants those to cooperate as much as possible. The importance of Central Asia for this geopolitical model can't be understated, and you can see in American analysts like Brzezinski, they talk about the need to keep the Eurasian continent divided in order to maintain American hegemony, and Dugin is well aware of this. He cites people like Brzezinski a lot. So American analysts accept that there are what Dugin calls meridian zones, these kind of natural geographical zones that divide the world, but they ignore the Russian Central Asian great space. The Atlanticist view of these zones is that there's an American pole with the EU as a close periphery, there's an Asian Pacific as the long periphery, and then Russian and Central Asia, as mentioned, have to be prevented independence to maintain unipolarity. So central to the Atlanticist view is a divided Eurasia, and then a reliant EU and a somewhat less reliant, but still not quite independent Asia Pacific. So an independent Central Asian zone is necessary to counterbalance the American zone and allow the independence of European and Pacific zones. Europe and the Pacific can't have true independence as long as this Atlanticist vision wins out, where Central Asia is divided and America can project power across the world in this way. So Dugin sees that there are these four natural zones, and he wants those instantiated in a global order. As mentioned, those zones would be Central Asia, Eurasia, Europe, which he sees, if there's to be a natural world order, that in these four zones that Europe and Africa will be its own pole, with the EU kind of in charge of that pole. North and South America is its own meridian zone, with the US naturally dominating that zone. And then there's a Pacific meridian zone, as he would call it, which China should be the natural hegemon of that zone. So that's the kind of natural world order, according to Dugin. That is an alternative globalism that would limit conflict, with Europe, Russia, China, and America as the kind of dominant poles within these great geographical meridian zones. Now, central to securing the Eurasian zone, Central Asian zone, is the Moscow-Tehran axis. Dugin sees this as absolutely the most important element in the Eurasian Russian strategy. He says the Moscow-Tehran axis will be the basis for further integration. Both Moscow and Iran are self-sufficient powers able to create their own organizational strategic model for the region. Afghani-Pakistan region will be transformed into an Islamic confederation that will be loyal to Iran and Russia. The next most important element of this is the Moscow-Delhi axis, cooperation with India. Russian-Indian cooperation is the second most important meridian axis in the integration of the Eurasian continent and the development of collective Eurasian security mechanisms. Importantly, there's also the integration of post-Soviet territories. So while Iran and India will have far more independence but must cooperate with Russia, as Dugin sees it, there has to be greater integration of former Soviet territories. Eurasianism seeks the reintegration of post-Soviet territory without the domination of any single religious or ethnic group. So this is how Dugin is trying to kind of sell this in the Eurasianist vision, is that it would be a kind of a community of equals. And central to this is the Moscow, Astana, Kiev triangle, as he calls it, which is this triangle of Ukraine, Russia, and Kazakhstan. He says it's enough to gain the support of Kazakhstan and Ukraine to succeed in the creation of the Eurasian Union. So the absolute top priorities for Russia geopolitically is securing a friendly Kazakhstan and Ukraine. And he writes in Eurasian Mission about how Ukraine is more urgent than ever, and that the similarities between Russians and Ukrainians have to be emphasized, and a Ukrainian nationalism that's exclusionary of Russia or anti-Russia needs to be combated. So this was written many years ago. Obviously it's very relevant now, and yeah, I think you can draw your own conclusions about that. Eurasianism as Weltanschauung, or as a kind of totalizing worldview. So according to Dugin, Eurasianism acknowledges the imperative of technical and social modernization without disregarding traditional culture. So again, this is the idea you get a lot from the new right, is this kind of marriage of the new and the old, of kind of postmodern social critique, modern technical progress, but with a traditional spirit, with a conservative bent. Dugan contrasts Eurasian postmodernism with Western postmodernism, and he says that Eurasian postmodernism promotes an alliance of tradition and modernism. This is again something that's kind of unique with Dugan, is you see him make use of kind of postmodernist critiques and ideas that sound very leftist. You know, he talks about, he'll quote people like Wittgenstein to talk kind of bolster his defense of like cultural relativism. As mentioned, new left thinkers like Foucault. But he thinks that these can be used to undermine and critique liberalism, but they can actually be used to kind of bolster a more traditional view of things. You know, once you undermine sort of bourgeois society with them, that it gives you reason to kind of look with new eyes on the traditional worldview. Eurasian philosophy doesn't deny the realities that were dismissed by the Enlightenment. Religion, ethnicity, empire, culture, etc., but embraces the best elements of modernism. So, of course, Dugan's main critique is always focused on liberalism, and this is really his core critique. This is the whole basis for his worldview, for political theory, is that liberalism is destroying these things that are of inherent value: religion, ethnic diversity, culture, and it's just this totalizing worldview that seeks to homogenize everything, seeks to impose universal values and wipe out traditional ways of living, wipe out cultural national diversity. And Dugan really sees Eurasianism and the fourth political theory as an attempt to combat this. So the basic principles of Eurasianism, according to Dugan, are what he calls differentialism, the idea that there's a plurality of value systems, which is contrasted with the conventional and obligatory domination of any single ideology. He contrasts tradition against the suppression of cultures. He wants to emphasize the wisdom of traditional society. He believes in the rights of nations versus the hegemony of Atlanticism. He sees ethnicities as of primary value, the primary value and the subjects of history versus the homogenization of peoples. This is one of Dugan's main critiques of liberalism, is that it seeks to homogenize the world. It seeks to enforce this liberal, abstract individual on the globe, and in doing so, it has to go to war with genuine diversity. It has to destroy unique ethnicities and cultures. He believes in social fairness and human solidarity, those kinds of left-wing ideals, versus the exploitation and the humiliation of man by man. So there's always a critique of economism and a critique of capitalism within his thought as well. He says, quote, "Against the establishment of the Atlanticist world order and globalization stand the supporters of the multipolar world, the Eurasianists. The Eurasianists defend on principle the necessity to preserve the existence of every people on Earth, the blossoming variety of cultures and religious traditions, and the unquestionable right of the peoples to independently choose their own path of historical development. The Eurasianists greet the dialogue of cultures and value systems with enthusiasm, and they cherish the organic combination of devotion to traditions and creative cultural innovations." So again, it just underscores what Dugan is getting at, to contrast heterogeneity, genuine cultural, religious, ethnic diversity versus this totalizing, homogenizing liberal machine. Now, as far as economics, Eurasianism's view of economics, he doesn't write a whole lot on this, but he says that there can't really be a universal system in economics. He's not going to outline, here is the ideal economic system, here are the principles that every country should follow. You know, this kind of free trade view of the world, where if every country in the world adopts this, we can have maximal efficiency and everyone can benefit. He rejects this kind of thinking about economics. He says economic systems should be derived from the historical and cultural features of the development of peoples and societies they affect. So there will be a unique economic model for all peoples, and it's ultimately up to them to decide that based on their own traditions, based on what is best for their culture, what won't kind of upset their own traditions. But large-scale sectors of the economy need to be kind of nationalized to ensure security. sectors like, things related to military industrial complex, communication, and so on. So he wants these huge sectors nationalized, the profits spread among the people. But then smaller sectors, small, medium-sized businesses, he wants them to organically develop. He wants them to be given maximum freedom. He wants maximum freedom on the local level for economics. And he calls this a third way model of economics. The economic principles, as he lays them out, are the subordination of the economy to higher civilizational spiritual values. And that is the ultimate economic principle for him. So economics is really secondary because of this. It's a rejection of economism. There's no answer in economics, but economics is something that's just pragmatically used, and it should always be subordinate to higher values. The macroeconomic integration and the division of labor on the scale of the great spaces, customs union. So again, this kind of regionalism that you don't have macroeconomics conducted on the scale of the nation state, but in these broader regions, and that everyone within them then can benefit from those economies of scale. And he wants quite a high level of economic integration. Within that, he wants a single financial, transportation, energy, productivity, and information system within the Eurasian space. He also wants the establishment of differentiating economic borders with neighboring great spaces and geoeconomic zones. So again, even in the realm of economics, he wants the regions kind of differentiated very clearly. Doesn't want economic globalism, free trade across the world, but autonomy within these spaces. As mentioned, the strategic control of the branches that form the basis of the economy by the center. So again, things like communication, important infrastructure, natural resources, that's controlled by the center. But then on the kind of periphery, small, medium-sized enterprises, maximal freedom for them. The organic combination of forms of economic management with the social, national, and cultural traditions of the region. So again, this is the core economic principle is that it shouldn't upset tradition, it shouldn't upset the unique cultures that it comes out of, and so there has to be maximal autonomy on the local level. Now we move on to the fourth political theory, and this is, of course, Dugin's magnum opus, where he lays out his alternative philosophical worldview. And why is it called the fourth political theory? That's a good starting point. Well, he says that the 20th century was characterized by the battle between these three great ideologies, these three great political theories. First of which was liberalism. Now, each of these ideas starts from a certain subject. Liberalism starts with the individualism, with the individual rather. Communism starts with class as its kind of starting point, its unit of analysis. And the third political theory of fascism starts with either the state or the folk as its subject of history, its unit of analysis. Dugin has critiques of all of these. In the case of liberalism, this is, as mentioned, this is the most important of these. It's the only one that survives. It's what Dugin sees as the chief enemy, the chief problem of our time. And liberalism is the essence of modernity. It takes the individual as the primary subject, and it tends to destroy collective identities. It starts with the individual, but it also has the individual as its goal. Dugin talks about this, that it starts with and ends with the individual. So it says that the individual is this rational, kind of free-floating subject. But also it has as its political project to create that subject, to free that subject, to allow everyone to kind of maximize the freedom of their will from that perspective. And so to do this, it has to destroy collective identities that are a barrier to that. National, religious, cultural, and to do this inevitably means to homogenize the world, and ultimately ends in committing ethnocide. Now, to oppose this in the 20th century, of course, you had communism. Communism failed to defeat capitalism and liberalism because of its own inner contradictions. Communism shares modern materialist assumptions of liberalism, and so Dugin doesn't see it as a real alternative. And he sees these liberal starting points of communism as ultimately the reason that it failed. On the other hand, there are elements of communism or socialism that Dugin wants to maintain: the advocacy of social justice, socialism itself, and a holistic approach to society, a holistic understanding of things, a holistic analysis of society, rather than the individualist view of things. Third political theory, which manifested as fascism and other mid-20th century ideologies, is rejected by Dugin because he sees it as racist, chauvinist, that it tries to put one group over another. He says this is ultimately the reason it was defeated, is because of the Germans' view of the Slavs as an inferior race, that this led them to underestimate them and lose the war. So he wants to reject fascism for having this supremacist view. He believes in total ethnic, cultural diversity. He believes in the folk as the starting point, but he thinks that in order to maintain that, you have to have this cultural relativism. You can't have the idea of one group being superior in any way, or then you get unnecessary conflict and imperialism. And he rejects that, but he wants to maintain from the third political theories the rejection of individualism and the emphasis on folk. Now, I think Dugin's critique here is a little weak in some aspects. It's very short when he talks about the third political theory, but there are plenty of versions of the third political theory, third position that Dugin doesn't cover, that his critiques don't really apply to, especially some of the kind of post-war approaches to it that remained in Europe. Could have looked at ideologies like Peronism, Strasserism, these kinds of things. But yeah, he rejects it on the basis of ethnic chauvinism. Now, he says the first thing to emerge as an alternative to these three ideologies was National Bolshevism, which sought to kind of combine all of the illiberal responses to liberalism. The nationalism, the kind of communist economic critique, social conservatism. So this is like the most anti-liberal worldview imaginable. So he sees it as a progressive step because it represents the socialism without the materialism, the atheism, the progressivism, the modernism, and it represents elements of third position but without the racism or supremacism. However, he sees it merely as a revision of other anti-liberal ideologies, and he sees it as a problem that doesn't embrace tradition. It's still kind of operating from maybe not a materialist worldview, but it doesn't have a great foundation for rejection of materialism. It's more a kind of reaction against liberalism, extreme reaction. And so he thinks there needs to be a stronger foundation, and that's why he looks to tradition and to traditional metaphysics. He says we should strongly reject anti-communism as well as anti-fascism. Both of them are counter-revolutionary tools in the hands of the global liberal elite. So although he rejects both of these ideologies, he does have a certain respect for them as attempts to overcome liberalism. And he thinks there's things to be learned from all of these responses to liberalism. And he sees, the focus on anti-communism, focus on Antifa, that this is used by the global liberal elite, this constant witch hunt against these illiberal ideologies, that it's used to just reinforce liberalism and kind of shut down discussion of alternatives to liberalism and critiques of liberalism. So he doesn't want to fall into that trap of going on witch hunts of either of these ideologies. Even if he has critiques of each, he's very much open to dialogue with people that hold these. He wants more dialogue. He wants more cooperation between all opponents of liberalism. Now, to look more deeply at liberalism itself, liberalism, as mentioned, starts with the rational individual, and it's a project of liberation from collective identity. Ethnic, religious, cultural, gender identity, all of these have to be overcome for this project of the liberation of this abstraction, this rational agent that is thrown into the world and is just this kind of bare will. The culmination of all of this this process of liberation from collective identities, according to Dugin, is transhumanism, which is ultimately the liberation from the human species itself. And it's quite interesting because he's had a lot to back him up in recent times. Places like the World Economic Forum that do host discussions about these kinds of things. That now we'll be liberated from humanity itself. That you'll have cyborgs, and you'll have clones, and you'll have people integrated with technology in new ways, and you may even have like a singularity where our consciousness is totally removed from the body and exists uploaded to computers or something. So Dugin sees this as like the culmination of the logic inherent in liberalism, where you seek to be to throw off the particular, to throw off any forms of collective identity. Liberalism presented itself as the only alternative to the two totalitarianisms of the 20th century. But the notion of the individual is a social concept imposed on the human being. Now, this is a sociological critique that Dugin takes from Emil Durkheim. He says liberalism is a totalitarian ideology that insists, through the classic methods of totalitarian propaganda, that the individual has the highest value. So this freedom is an illusion. The more that someone tries to assert their individualism within a liberal paradigm, the more conformist they become, the more they fall into things like consumerism and sort of standard ways of expressing individualism. And so liberalism is based on this lie of being a sort of freely chosen ideology, whereas in fact, at every level of society, at every level of the institutions and social discourse, this liberal view of the human subject has to be continually imposed and enforced. So liberalism is actually the third totalitarianism. It brings with itself the stereotyping and homogenization of the world, which destroys all forms of diversity and differentiation. And then, having achieved hegemony after the defeat of fascism and communism, liberalism ultimately seeks to abolish politics altogether. This is the idea of the end of history, that there is no alternative, that we're in a post-political age, that all of these questions have been solved. And with the victory of liberalism, then you get the imposition of human rights. The individual becomes the normative subject within the framework of all mankind. Human rights doctrine is just this attempt to impose the liberal subject on all of humanity, to make that the starting point for every people. But a humanity comprised of individuals is naturally drawn towards universality and global governance. So the end point of liberalism, according to Dugin, once you have this idea of the alienated abstract individual, there has to be one form of government that's best for everyone, of course. If really we're not separated by any kind of inborn differences, then there must be a universal political system for everyone to live under. And so global governance, having a one world government that imposes the same values on everyone and protects everyone's rights in the same way, just follows logically from that. So liberalism, according to Dugin, necessarily morphs into the idea of the New World Order, global government. The triumph of liberalism also morphs into post-liberalism. Liberalism no longer has political dimensions. It doesn't represent free choice, but instead becomes a kind of historically deterministic destiny. Again, this is interesting because some people would say that, well, this critique of liberalism, that the West has become kind of post-liberal in how it operates, in the way that it enforces its worldview on its subjects. But this is something that Dugin himself predicted and included in his critique of liberalism, is that it has to become post-liberal. Once these values become universal, once they become unquestioned, once it's apolitical, it's not even within the spectre of politics to discuss these starting points, then it becomes destiny, the end of history, that this was what we were always progressing towards, was universal liberalism. And so then, imposing that end of history can ultimately be justified by almost any means. And so you get the post-liberal state that will impose this value of liberation from collective identity, of the alienated subject, will impose it with extreme authoritarianism if necessary. So Dugin actually, in fourth political theory, when he talks about liberalism, sometimes he uses it interchangeably, liberalism, post-liberalism. He sees one as an outgrowth of the other. Now, obviously, the main response in the 20th century, and probably today as well, is the left, is communism. People that are alienated with liberalism, with bourgeois society, turn to communism. And Dugin critiques heavily the failures of the old left, primarily the fact that the predictions of Marxism were just proven wrong. Marxism failed as a way to understand society. Marxist revolution happened in agrarian societies, whereas Marx predicted that they would happen in heavily industrialized, developed societies. And when communism did succeed, it had to rely on nationalism to maintain power and cohesiveness, which again shows a failing in the Marxist conception of the human subject. Orthodox Marxist analysis, while it may have had some good critiques of industrial society at the time that Marx was writing, Dugin doesn't think that it's fit for post-industrial or the information society. That the means of control, the nature of capital, the nature of the class system has changed so much in a way that Marx's critique can't really keep up with. Marxism fundamentally is not a true alternative to liberalism because it shares the values of liberalism, the modernism, the atheism, the materialism, cosmopolitanism. From a certain perspective, Marx was seeking the same kind of end goal as many liberals in terms of the absolute liberation of the individual, liberation from collective identity, this kind of maximal material well-being where everyone has everything provided for and can be a kind of Renaissance man, this kind of version of like positive liberty that would be brought about by the collective ownership of the means of production. But again, there's no spiritual element to this. Marx is obviously a materialist and an atheist, and so it's not really a rejection of the economism of capitalism. It's not a true rejection of modernity. There are also the social democrats, the more kind of moderate leftists, and they offer no serious challenge to liberalism either, because while they may argue with conservatives about economic aspects of liberalism, and they may critique neoliberalism and some of the effects of globalization and free trade on the working class and so on, they've ultimately embraced a libertarian social view, and so they're not a real challenge to liberalism either. They will argue about nuts and bolts of the economy. Maybe they'll be for universal healthcare or certain things that kind of undermine this globalist view. But again, they've accepted the whole social view of liberalism. So then he looks at the new left, which obviously, many people in the 20th century recognized the failings of Marxism, the growth of Marxist humanism, what gets called cultural Marxism. The new left appeared in the 1950s and 60s, and they sought to wage an attack on bourgeois society from all directions: culture, politics, art, science. These were people that were very much inspired by Antonio Gramsci, the Frankfurt School, and they sought to, instead of just hoping for a economic revolution from the base, from the contradictions of the economic relations of capitalism, they thought they could bring about this revolution through influence in culture, through influence in the superstructure. And ultimately what came out of this was the new left vision of the attempt to define a new future was very heavily based on Rousseau's idea of the noble savage. A rejection of kind of bourgeois rationalism, universal reason, and their attempt to define a new future has these qualities. Firstly, the refusal of reason, this idea of Deleuze and Guattari, of like choosing schizophrenia. The abolition of man as the measure of all things, this postmodern idea of the death of man or the death of the author. The overcoming of all sexual taboos, the abolition of perversions, freedom to choose sex, widespread pornography, all of these kinds of things that the left sees this as kind of waging war on bourgeois society to normalize these things. Legalization of all kinds of drugs for the same reason. Passing to new forms of spontaneous and sporadic being. So this is how the left attempts to overcome what they saw as the stuffy bourgeois conservative culture of capitalism. You can see this kind of view of things, the noble savage, the collective humanity united against the machine. It's this kind of matrix view of things. But the New Left social critique has largely been embraced by capitalism, and this shows how these values, this attack on morality and reason, that these values actually only benefited capitalism. You can see it in the embracing of postmodern art, cinema. Tarantino movies are just an example of postmodern cinema. So these things have been easily embraced by the machine, by the system, and rather than actually undermining capitalism, it's just undermined opposition to capitalism. It's helped hollow out the working class, hollow out forms of collective identity that could have formed as opposition to the neoliberal machine. And so the New Left promotion of liberal social values, pseudo-environmentalism, and their embrace of post-humanism actually serves to strengthen globalism and liberalism. So in comes the fourth political theory, having acknowledged the failures of the left, having looked deeply at the problems of liberalism, why it must be opposed, and having kind of quickly rejected third position ideologies. Dugin comes in with the fourth political theory, and he seeks to oppose liberalism without the contradictions that he outlined of the previous ideologies. But he wants to integrate the best features. So that means socialism without materialism, without atheism, without the modern worldview attached to it. The third position, rejection of individualism and the focus on folk as the starting point, the subject of history, but without the racial or the nationalist, chauvinist elements, without any kind of supremacy. But it goes beyond national Bolshevism, which, as mentioned, was this kind of reactionary attempt to overcome liberalism. It goes beyond that by appealing to tradition and looking to pre-modern societies. From tradition, it takes the Platonic ideal state, this philosophical way of theorizing about the ideal state, the organic state. From medieval worldview, it takes the idea of a hierarchical society, an order to nature, the great chain of being, that can be reflected back on society. And it also looks to various theological visions of a normative social order from every great religion tradition. And against the liberal subject of the individual, which, as we mentioned, the starting point of liberalism is this abstract individual, it proposes Dasein as the subject. So, remember we said communism, the starting point is class. Liberalism, the starting point is the individual. Fascism, the starting point is the state. Well, the fourth political theory, Dugin's notion, is quite similar to the third position ideologies. He starts with the folk, but as he would term it, he starts with Dasein. Now, as mentioned, Dugin is a Heidegger scholar. He's written 4 books on Heidegger. He calls himself a Heideggerian, hugely influential on Dugin, and a lot of fourth political theory, the book, is devoted to Heidegger. I find some of it a little obscurantist, kind of unnecessary, but for Dugin it's absolutely central. So the fourth political theory seeks an alternative to the liberal subject of the disembodied individual, and this is similar to Heidegger's kind of critique of Western philosophy, and specifically of Descartes' Cartesianism, this idea of the disembodied cogito, thinking sort of ego. And against that, Heidegger proposes the idea of Dasein. For Heidegger, the human subject has to be conceived of in a totally new way. We have to have a totally new conception of being and our relation to it. And he comes up with this idea of being in the world, or Dasein, which literally translates as their being. So against the liberal idea of the free-floating, abstract ego that's just kind of thrown into the world, the human being is actually a unitary entity that's always in the world. So it's always a their being. We're always kind of bound up geographically and with aspects of subjectivity and meaning that we can't get outside of. So Dugin embraces this, and he believes that it allows him to formulate an ontological conception of peoplehood. That it's not just, if you start from the liberal subject, that it's not just an amalgamation of individual wills coming together collectively to kind of contractually form a society, or it's not just a numerical counting of wills, but it's a Dasein. There's a Dasein to a folk. There's a Dasein to an ethnicity. So for the fourth political theory, freedom can now be conceived as freedom of subjectivity. Against the liberal idea of freedom that's just focused on liberating the individual, with this idea of Dasein, of embedded being, now we can focus on freedom from the perspective of the freedom of subjectivity of the Dasein, the freedom to express people's unique peoplehood, to express their own ethnocentrism, to express their own culture and religion. And so Dugin writes a lot about making this the basis for a new political theory, rejecting the disembodied individual and embracing this embodied Dasein. And this leads into his discussion of the relativity of time. This is probably the most esoteric part of political theory. Not hugely necessary, I would say, to understand Dugin's political perspective. And again, I'm not usually into this. I find he's a little bit obscurantist in a lot of this. Maybe it's because of the translation from Russian. Some of it is very esoteric, the way he writes. And question the value of it. But this is, Dugin writes a lot about this, the relativity of time. He says that there's as many conceptions of time as there are societies. So this is probably a difficult thing for a lot of us to understand when we first see it. A lot of people, this will be the first time they encounter an idea like this. But actually there isn't one time. Each society has its own time, and that totally shapes the society's view of everything. The whole way that we conceive of the world is bound up with time. We're always thinking about time. And there's these different notions of time that are culture dependent. There's the idea of cyclical time, as mentioned earlier with the Kali Yuga. The Hindus and many pagan societies have this idea that the universe is just perpetually going through cycles: golden age, silver age, bronze age, dark age, and then return to golden age. There's the progressive view of time, which we have today, which liberalism has kind of universalized, that time is advancing. We're constantly making material progress, and so time is progressing towards something. But there's also a regressive view of time. There's a messianic view of time, that everything is progressing towards some religious endpoint. So time is socially constructed by Dasein, or by society. And according to Dugin, Dasein, quote, instills time in the perception of the object. So our societal sort of collective view of time decides the whole way that we understand our interaction with reality, decides the whole way we conceive of almost everything in everyday life. So he sees this as absolutely crucial. And in modern society, time is seen as irreversible and progressive. And this is the basis for the liberal worldview. But Dugin rejects this progressive view of time. And according to him, the fourth political theory allows us to think about time in a totally new way. And it allows us to actually reassert a view of the reversibility of time. That actually we can reverse time and go back to the values of, say, medieval society. This is something that's unthinkable according to liberalism. One analogy he uses that's helpful is, he takes this from Husserl, the phenomenologist who inspired Heidegger. He analogizes time as music. So he says the past is present in the present. Husserl calls it the continuous instance when he's analogizing time with music. The present becomes continuous, and it includes the past as a vanishing presence. So, when you listen to music, you don't just hear one note, but the whole time you're listening to music, you're interpreting it and hearing it in the context of the minutes of music you've heard before that. That's the only way it makes sense. That's the only way it has any meaning. And this, according to Dugin, is the methodological key for understanding history, because history is the awareness of the presence of the past in the present. So again, this is a kind of very folkish, kind of embedded view of time. And even if this seems esoteric or it seems kind of baseless in terms of accepting it, I mean, you can see that the logic of this is that he's trying to conceive of time in a new way, in a way that is not so amenable to liberalism with its notion of infinite progress. And this way of analogizing time to music and the continuous unfolding of the present, but the past present in the present. This is very much amenable to his kind of folkish, ethnocentric view of how things should be. So for Dasein to exist in the world, for there to be authentic being, there has to be multiple societies with their own mythologies and their own conceptions of time. So again, this gets back to Dugin's central values of heterogeneity, of cultural, religious, ethnic diversity. And that's why we have to have multiple mythologies, multiple ways of conceiving of time, because this is ultimately the basis for the whole sort of folkish worldview, the whole metaphysics. And so if we allow that to be replaced, if we allow this progressive, linear, liberal view of time to become hegemonic, then we've destroyed diversity, we've destroyed the potential of Dasein to exist in the world, and you have this homogenized, materialist, transhumanist, very bleak view of things. So that is the fourth political theory. That is the thought of Duginism, Eurasianism. And yeah, I hope that was helpful. As I say, there's a lot of talk about Dugin. He's a figure that constantly inspires controversy, discussion, and speculation. But as you can see, in some ways, his thought is a lot less controversial or extreme or radical than some people would present it. There are certainly issues I would take with it. I think there are many critiques that can be made. But for today, it will just be a summary of his thought. And hopefully this will be helpful to those of you who watched. If you enjoy it, if you appreciate it, please hit the like button, leave a comment if you feel like it, and subscribe to the channel. And yeah, that's all for now. Thanks for tuning in, and take care.